The human joked, "You'd make a sweet wife." The Orc Queen froze and said, "I accept, leave me, human. I will not beg." She lay half sunk in the frozen mud of the ravine, one leg pinned beneath her dead warhorse, blood darkening the snow around her thigh. Fever had already glazed her eyes, yet she bared her teeth like something that still meant to fight. Jorge heard her from the ridge while checking the last of his snares. He set down his hatchet and the frayed coil of snare line at his belt and half slid down the icy slope toward her, hands raw, coat too thin for the wind. He knelt, pressing his scarf against the wound before he could think better of it. Beneath the mud on her breastplate, half hidden, a silver clan sigil caught the last light. He did not know it marked her as queen. If you are new here, welcome to Orcbond's Saga, the channel where humans and orcs meet across everything that should have kept them apart. And love is built out of small, stubborn kindnesses. Take a moment to subscribe and tap the like button before we begin, so the next tale of two worlds finds its way straight to you. She had survived 3 battles, 2 hard winters, and a betrayal by her own blood. It was a half-starved human trapper, with kind hands, who would come to frighten her most. It took him the better part of an hour to free her. The horse had gone down hard, its full weight across her right leg, and the cold had done half the killing already. Jorge worked a length of broken branch under the carcass for leverage, wedged a flat stone beneath it for a fulcrum, and threw his whole thin body against the far end while she pushed with what strength the fever had left her. The branch bowed. The horse shifted a hand's width, no more, and she made a low sound in her throat that was not a scream, only because she would not let it be. He reset the stone higher and tried again. On the 3rd heave, the dead weight rolled, and she dragged herself free across the ice on her elbows, leaving a long, dark smear behind her. It was while he was clearing the last of it that his hand closed on something buried in the churned snow. The snapped shaft of an arrow, black-fletched, the wood stained darker than any hunter he knew would carry. He turned it over once, frowning, and pushed it into his belt without knowing why, and thought no more of it that hour. He had a bleeding stranger to keep from dying, and questions could wait for the fire. She was enormous. Even folded on the ground and shaking, she was clearly built on a scale that had nothing to do with him. Shoulders broad as a doorway, forearms thicker than his calves, a jaw that could have been cut from the same grey stone as the ravine walls. When she got a foot under herself and stood, she swayed, and Jorge ducked under her arm without thinking, and for one long moment her whole crushing weight came down on his narrow frame. His knees nearly buckled. He locked them and held, teeth set, until she found her own balance and took the weight back. She looked down at him doing it, and something crossed her face that he could not read. His cabin sat at the ragged edge of the hollow pine, where the trees thinned into rock and the trail south gave out entirely. It was one room of stacked timber, with a roof he had patched twice that autumn. The wind found every seam in the walls. Inside, there was a heart blackened by 6 years of fires, a narrow bed, a table he had split and pegged himself, and a shelf lined with small carved animals, a fox, a hare, a wren with folded wings that no one had ever come to buy. The pantry held a low sack of barley, 3 onions, a knob of hard cheese, and a single smoked trout he had been saving against a bad week. It was a poor place, but the floor was swept clean, the 2 thin blankets were folded square, and bundles of dried herbs hung from the roof beam, tied off with the same careful hand that had carved the wren. She lay still and let a soldier's eye go around the room, and the room told her everything he would not. 1 bowl on the shelf, 1 cup, 1 plate, 1 spoon worn thin on the same side from the same hand, 1 chair at the table, and a second stool pushed into the corner under a film of dust, kept but never sat in. Among the carved animals on the shelf stood one that was only half made, a small, rough horse no bigger than a child's fist, its legs not yet cut free of the block, set down years ago and never taken up again. And through the one clouded window, out on the white shoulder of the ridge, a single mounded shape under the snow, too small and too carefully edged to be anything but a grave. No portraits, no other voice. She had been carried into the house of a man who had taught himself to need almost nothing, and she understood, before he had told her a single word of it. that he had not always been so alone, and that whatever had emptied the second chair had very nearly emptied him with it. Jorge was 32. His hands were split across the knuckles and hard with old callus, and he moved through the small room with the quiet economy of a man who had done every task in it alone for a long time. He had run a trapline through these woods for 6 years, since the winter that took his wife Elizabeth, and 2 nights behind her, their daughter, who had burned with a fever he could not break. He had not walked back down to the village since. The village had not walked up to find him. He laid her on his own bed by the fire, and she let him, watching every movement with pale gold eyes that never once fully closed. When he brought a cup of water, she emptied it in 3 swallows and demanded, in a voice like gravel dragged over iron, to know what he wanted from her. The words came out formal and clipped, the vowels bent into strange shapes. He told her, without looking up from the wound, that what he wanted was for her to stop bleeding on his floor. She stared at him for a long moment, and something behind her eyes shifted, as though no one had answered her that plainly in years. She misread his gentleness at every turn. When he drew the blanket up to her chin, she flinched as though he had raised a hand to her, then went rigid, waiting to learn the price of the kindness. And he misread her in turn, took her flat, blunt questions for contempt, and grew smaller and quieter around her. 2 things he noticed that first night, and could not account for. The first was a heavy ring on her forefinger, dark metal set with a green stone, worn to a soft shine, as though it had never once left her hand. The second was her hair. It had plainly once been bound into a long, complex braid, tight and deliberate. The kind of thing that takes an hour and another pair of hands, but it had been hacked half through and torn loose, so that it hung ragged at one side of her head like a banner cut down in a field. She kept touching the ruined edge of it in her sleep. The way a man touches a wound, he cannot stop worrying. He did not understand that among her people a warrior's braid was rank and name, and belonging all worked into one, and that a torn braid was a thing done to the disgraced and the dead. He only thought it a shame, that ruined braid, and left it alone. Like so many watching from across distant lands, he had only ever heard tales of orcs, never once imagining that he would shelter one under his own patched roof. If you want to see how this unlikely meeting changes both their worlds, stay with us through this journey. Near the turn toward dawn, she cried out a name he did not know, Caldmore, and then a second word, half-shaped, that carried the weight of a title and came wrapped in grief. He did not wake her. He sat by the low coals and listened to a stranger mourn in her sleep, and wondered who was out in the same cold looking for her, and whether they meant to help her or to finish what the ravine had begun. By the coals, he took out the black-fletched shaft he had pulled from the snow and turned it over in his fingers. It was no hunter's arrow. The fletching was dyed, deliberate, the mark of someone who wanted their kills known. He did not understand what it meant. He knew only, with the flat certainty of a man who had lived long alone in the woods, that whoever had lost it was not finished, and that they would come looking for what it had missed. Jorge had not always lived at the end of the world. He had grown up the middle son of a village blacksmith 2 valleys south, in a loud and ordinary house. He had wanted, in the small and decent way of boys, only to make things that lasted. A good chair, a true door, a table that would not wobble in 50 years. He had married Elizabeth at 24 in a field of late clover, and for a handful of years the whole of the world had been the size of the 2 of them, and then the 3 of them, and it had been enough. The fever came in the winter when his daughter turned 4. Jorge held cold clothes for her all through 3 nights. On the second he walked 4 miles through hip-deep snow to the herb woman and half-carried her back, and she looked at his daughter for a long moment and would not lie to him, only shook her head. He had done every single thing a man could do, and had loved with the whole of his chest while he did it, and none of it had been enough. When Elizabeth followed within the week, something in him stopped speaking for a season. In the spring, he shouldered a pack and a coil of wire, and walked north until the villages ran out, and taught himself the trade of the trapline the hard way. One frozen season at a time. There had been, before the fever, one other night that shaped him. A boy from the next farm had gone through the river ice in a spring flood, and Jorge, 17 and quick, had gone in after him and came up alone with nothing in his arms but the cold. Between the boy and the fever, he had built the whole of his reasoning about the world, that he would not, whatever it cost his own body, stand on a bank or in a doorway and let the cold take a life while he still had breath and hands to spend against it. He had failed at it twice, and still he could not put it down, because to put it down would be to say the two of them had been for nothing. So when a voice came up out of the ravine, he did not weigh it against his own safety. He went. The orc's name was Catherine, and she was queen of the Caldmore, though she would not say so for many days yet. She had been born to the iron of it. Her mother had been war chief before her, in an unbroken line of women who had held the northern stoneholds against 3 centuries of raiders and starving winters. Catherine had been handed a training blade at 6 and a killing one at 12. She had been taught before anything else that a Caldmore did not show pain, did not show fear, did not show need, because 10,000 people slept the sounder for believing their queen felt none of the 3. She had led warriors in the field at 19. She had buried her mother at 23 and taken up the iron circlet in the same grey hour, her mourning paint still wet, because a clan cannot be seen to waver. In 29 years, she had never once been allowed to be simply ordinarily tired. She was alone in a human forest, half a corpse in the mud, because her own war council had turned its knife on her. Her father's old adviser, Mulgrim, broad and grey and patient, who had counselled 3 generations of Caldmore from a seat close to the throne, had decided the clan wanted a firmer hand upon it, and that the hand should be his, reached to power through a marriage he meant to force. When Catherine refused him to his face before the full assembly, naming the marriage what it was in front of every elder in the hall, he moved faster than she had judged him able. She had thought she had bought a season to gather the loyal. She had bought a single night. Loyal guards died at their posts in the dark, quietly, before any horn could be raised. Her old shield woman, Brenna, who had stood at her back since Catherine was a girl of 12 with a new blade, put herself in a doorway so that Catherine could reach the stables, and did not come out of it. That was the last face of her own she had seen before the forest, Brenna in the doorway, telling her to run and not to look back, and above all things not to die cheaply. Mulgrim's warriors carried black-fletched arrows, an affectation of his personal guard, and it was one of those, loosed at her fleeing back and buried in her saddle, that she had snapped off in the ravine when the horse went down. She had cut the rest of the way out of her own hold with her own sword and ridden north into human lands, because no orc alive would think to hunt a Caldmore queen among the very people her kind had been taught to despise. The wound in her that never healed was older even than the coup. It was this, that in 29 years no soul had ever wanted her for anything except her strength. Suitors had wanted her holds and her passes. Even those who had loved her, and a few truly had, loved the queen, the shield, the unbending thing at the cold centre of the clan that let everyone else afford to bend. She had learned young to mistake being needed for being seen, and so she had gone hungry her whole life without ever once learning the name of the hunger. The ghost she carried north was her mother's last command, given rough and low from a deathbed. Hold them together, whatever it takes out of you. She had told the trapper none of it. But she had watched him give away his only fish and sleep on his own cold floor, and ask her for nothing at all. And she could not make the shape of it fit inside anything she had ever been taught about the weak. Far to the south, in the great stone hall that had been hers a fortnight before, Mulgrim was not idle. He did not rage when the first riders came back without her body. Rage was for smaller men. He sat in the seat that was not yet warm to him, and asked in his patient way only one thing, which of the northern gates the queen had ridden for the night she fled. When he was told the eastern stable gate, the one only a handful of the household guard had ever held a key to, he nodded and did not raise his voice, and did not ask how his hunters had known to loose their arrows on that one road out of all the roads she might have taken. He already knew the answer to that. He had bought it, And the thing he had bought was still standing even now among the loyal few who had escaped the coup with their lives, wearing their grief like a badge and waiting to be told what came next. He sent the black arrows north, and he told the hunters, in the mild voice he used for everything, that the woman they sought would not be armored and crowned. She would be starved and hidden and half dead, and grateful to the first soul who showed her kindness, and that this softness of the corner was exactly how they would know her. For the first days she trusted nothing in the cabin, least of all the man in it. He changed the dressing on her thigh each morning and each night, and every time she held herself like cut stone. He gave her the bed and took the bare floor, and when she demanded to know why he weakened himself for a stranger, he only said she was hurt and he was not, as though that closed the matter. To an orc who counted worth in strength spent and strength shown, a man who poured his out on others and made no boast of it, was very nearly a door with no latch. The first true crack came over a bird. A jay had grown bold at the sill, and one grey morning it landed on the very rim of the barley pot, while Jorge's back was turned and made off with a whole strip of dried apple, nearly as long as itself, thumping into the doorframe on the way out. Jorge yelped and lunged and missed entirely, and sat down flat on the floor. And Catherine, Queen of the Keldmore, who had not laughed since the hour her mother died, laughed. It came up out of her rough and startled, and she pressed the back of her hand to her mouth as though she might catch it and put it back. And Jorge, sitting on the floorboards, forgot for a moment to breathe, because it was the first time she had looked to him beautiful instead of terrifying. He grinned up at her before he knew he was doing it. Something in the small, cold room shifted a finger's width, and neither of them named it. The piece of it lasted exactly as long as the old snow did. Fresh powder fell that night, and in the blue of the next dawn, Jorge went out to walk his lines the way he did every morning, and stopped dead 40 paces from his own door, cut clean into the new snow, circling the cabin at the tree line, and then away again, ran a single trail of boot prints. They were enormous, half again the length of his own boot, deep-pressed, an orc's stride, and they did not come close, and they did not leave in a hurry. They watched. Whoever had made them had stood a long while behind the third pine on the rise, where the whole front of the cabin lay open, shifting foot to foot against the cold, and had gone away again without ever knocking. Jorge crouched over the sign and read it the way he read everything in these woods, and what it told him turned his stomach. The prints were not all of one night. Someone had been coming back. He did not tell her, not yet. Instead, he did the one thing he knew how to do. Over that day and the next he set a second line around the cabin, not for game this time, but tripwire and deadfall and a snare across the single blind approach. The quiet craft of a man who had kept himself alive alone in the wild for 6 years, and did not mean to be surprised in his own doorway. He said nothing to Catherine of why he had grown watchful, but she was a soldier, and she had seen his face come back wrong from the tree line, and she had begun, without a word, to sleep with the hatchet within reach of her good hand. She tried the next day to earn her keep. She would not lie abed while a lesser creature fed her, she informed him, and she took the barley pot and the onions and set herself to making the soup he made. What she produced could have stripped paint from a door. She had scorched the barley to the bottom, drowned it in 3 times the water it wanted, and salted it as though provisioning an army against a siege. Jorge ate a full bowl of it anyway, straight-faced, sweating, telling her gravely that it had character. She watched him force down the second spoonful, and told him flatly that he was a liar and a coward, and that a Keldmore did not lie even to be kind. And then she laughed again, at herself this time, and it was a better sound than the first. He kept the ruined pot going 3 days, rather than admit defeat. The soup became, without either of them deciding it, the thing they measured the days by. The walls came down a hand at a time. She began teaching him her tongue, the word for honor, which was also the word for spine, the word for home, which could not be shaped without the deep of the throat, so that his first attempt came out like a cat sneezing and set her laughing. Their customs collided just as often. She woke on the 4th day, found him bathing at the basin stripped to the waist, and told him approvingly, apropos of nothing, and that he was better made than his skinny wrists had led her to expect, and would breed strong sons. and then watched. With genuine scientific interest, the colour climbed his whole face and neck while he knocked the basin off its stand. Among orcs, she explained, only a coward hid what he thought of a body. Among humans, he explained back, strangling the words, a man liked a little warning first. She filed this away as the single most baffling thing she had ever learned about his people and brought it up, deliberately, whenever she wanted to watch him drop something, far to the south. A hunter came back to Mulgrim to report that the Queen's trail had gone cold in human country, and that the man sent ahead to watch had not returned. Mulgrim listened to all of it without a flicker. Then he asked the hunter gently whether he had crossed the river to be sure, or whether he had turned back at the ice. The hunter, who had turned back at the ice, made the mistake of lying about it. Mulgrim let him finish, and thanked him for his service, and had him taken out into the yard and killed there in the snow in front of the others, not in anger. He told them afterward, but because a body that carries a lie in it has already begun to rot, and a wise clan does not wait for the rot to spread. He had the dead man's black arrows gathered up and given to someone who would cross the river. Then he went in out of the cold and asked his quiet informant whether the Queen had ever, in all their years of service, spoken of a place in the north she might run to. He was a patient man. He could afford to be. Winter was doing half his work for him. He got his own back once. He tried to teach her the human way of sealing a bargain, the clasped hand, palm to palm, and reached out to take her hand. She caught his wrist instead in a grip that could have snapped kindling, dropped into a fighting crouch, and demanded to know what he thought he was starting, because among her people a stranger who seized your open hand was offering to break it. It took him a long, careful minute, both of them frozen, to explain that it was meant as friendship and not a first move toward a wrestling match. She let go, considered it, and pronounced the custom idiotic, a people who greeted friends the same way they might grab an enemy's sword arm. Then gravely, she offered him her own huge hand to try again, and shook his so hard his teeth clicked, and looked enormously pleased with herself. He asked one evening about the braid, and her face closed, and then slowly opened. She told him what it was. Rank and name and clan all worked into the plaiting, read by any orc at a glance the way a human reads a crest. Hers had been cut, she said, by someone who wanted the world to think she was already dead. When he asked, carefully, whether it could be mended, she said only an orc hand knew the pattern, and hers could not reach the back of her own head, one-handed with the leg the way it was. So he learned it. She sat before the fire and talked him through it strand by strand, cursing his clumsiness in 2 languages, and he, who could coax a wren out of a splinter of pine, worked his rough, careful fingers through the great dark rope of her hair until, after 3 ruined attempts and a great deal of blunt orcish commentary on his ancestry, it held. It was not a fine braid. She told him as much at length. But it was whole, and when he had finished she reached up and felt the back of it for a long moment and went very quiet, and told him, in a different voice than she had used for anything before, that the last hands to touch her hair had been the ones that cut it, and that she had not thought to feel another set there and mean her no harm. She did not say thank you. Among her people, she had told him, you did not thank someone for kindness. You remembered it, and you paid it back tenfold when their own hour came. He did not know it yet, but she had just made him a promise. It was 2 nights after the braid that her wound turned. He had cleaned it every day, but the cold and the long hours in the mud had put something into it his herbs could not reach. And by the 2nd evening, the flesh around the stitches had gone hot and shining, and the fever climbed back into her the way the tide came up a beach. She grew confused, then quiet. Chorke knew the look. He had watched it take his daughter. There was one thing that broke a wound fever, a black, bitter marsh root that grew only on the flats across the river, and he kept a small dried store of it in a cache 3 hours' hard walk downstream, against exactly this kind of winter. The river had frozen, but not all the way through. He went anyway, because the other choice was to sit and watch her die the way he had watched before. And he had promised himself, 17 years ago and again, 6 years ago, that he would not sit and watch again. He crossed at the narrows below the great falls, where the whole cataract had frozen mid-plunge into a hanging blue wall 3 stories high, groaning and cracking in the dark, and the sky above it had caught fire, long slow ribbons of green and violet unrolling across the black. The northern lights he had seen a dozen times in his life and never once stopped to wonder at. He had no time to wonder at them now. Halfway across, the ice let go under his back foot with a sound like a snapped bone, and he went into the waist into water so cold it drove the breath clean out of him, and he clawed himself flat onto the groaning surface and lay there shaking and did not let go of the pouch at his chest. He reached the cache. He came back before dawn, half frozen, and boiled the black root down and got it between her teeth a spoonful at a time through the worst of the night. Near morning the fever broke and her eyes cleared and found him soaked, blue-lipped, shuddering by the fire, a man who had crossed a breaking river in the dark for a stranger, and she looked at him a long time and said nothing at all, because there was nothing in her language large enough to say. He rewound the linen on her thigh that same evening and became aware, all at once, of the heat of her skin and the sheer banked strength of her, and had to still his own hand before she noticed it shake. Later, close to a fire burning down to coals, she asked him why he lived so far from every living person, and he told her, the fever, the cloths, Elizabeth, the small grave he had opened with his own hands. She did not reach for comfort. She only listened, and when he finished she told him, flat and certain, that he had not failed, that some fights are lost the moment they begin, and there is no shame owed for losing them. It was the first time in 6 years anyone had said the one thing he needed to hear. He carved through the quiet hours the way other men drink. One evening he set a new piece on the table beside her without a word, a small horse. Mid-stride, mane thrown back, the animal she had ridden into the ground and left dead in the ravine, given back to her in pine no bigger than her thumb. She turned it over and over in her enormous hand, and her jaw worked, and she said nothing, and she did not set it down again. She kept it. He saw her, after, close her fist around it in her sleep, the way she had once touched the ruined braid. A blizzard came down off the peaks 3 nights later, the kind that buries a valley whole, and near the middle of the night the snow weight caved a corner of the roof he had patched twice that autumn, and the storm came howling straight into the room. There was no talking their way through that one. They worked it together in the shrieking dark, Jorge up in the gap, lashing a fresh crossbeam into place with the last of his snare line, Catherine beneath him, taking the whole weight of the sagging roof onto her shoulders and holding it, arms shaking and breath tearing, a quarter of a cabin, balanced on the strength of one injured orc so that a human could tie a knot. It took them till nearly dawn, and somewhere in the middle of it, half shouting over the wind, passing beams and cord hand to hand, they talked the way people only talk when their hands are too busy to let them be careful. He asked her at last the thing he had not asked, who she truly was. Why would men with dyed arrows cross frozen rivers to find one lost traveller? And she told him, not the truth, but a truth, one she had plainly settled on some nights before. She was a warrior of the Caldmore, she said, a rider of rank, one who had carried the Queen's own word and worn the Queen's own colours, which was why she spoke as she did and bore herself as she did, and why the enemies of her clan would want her silenced. She let him believe her ring and her braid were a soldier's honours and not a crown's. It was close enough, she told herself, to keep him safe. The less he knew, the less they could ever make him pay. She watched his face in the stormlight, take the lie in and believe it. And something in her twisted, because it was the first thing she had ever lied to him about, and because he had just held a caving roof off her head without knowing she was worth the lie. Neither of them said aloud what was happening, but he had begun to think he did not want her to leave, and she had begun to think she had never in the whole of her life felt this quiet inside her own chest. It was on just such an evening, easy and warm, that he made the joke. She had been describing, straight-faced, the old orc marriage custom in which 2 families spend a whole day trying to out-insult one another to prove the match can survive anything. He had laughed until his eyes ran, and said without thinking at all, shaking his head, that with a temper and an axe arm like hers, she would make some lucky warlord a sweet wife. Catherine went completely, utterly still. For a moment the only sound was the fire. Then she asked him, low and careful, whether that was how humans chose a mate, with a jest tossed across a table. Flustered, he said no, it was only a thing people said, it meant nothing. She studied his face a long time, as though weighing something heavy, and told him that among her people a thing spoken aloud with witnesses was a thing meant, and that no Caldmore jested about the naming of a wife any more than they jested about the naming of the dead. He opened his mouth to apologize. That was when the wolves came. They came out of the dark, drawn by the smell of the dead horse still down in the ravine. A whole starving pack of them, and when they had stripped, that they came up the slope for whatever else was warm. The first Jorge knew of it was the shutter rattling and a low chorus of growls circling the cabin walls. The fire was too low. The door was already half off its hinge from the day it had been kicked, and a big grey male hit it hard enough to knock the topboard loose. There was no time to be afraid properly. Jorge threw the last of the dry wood on the fire to drive the light out at them, snatched a brand from the hearth, and put his back to the wall beside the door. Catherine was up on her bad leg with his hatchet before he could tell her to stay down, and the two of them held the broken doorway together. He stabbed the burning brand at anything that showed teeth. She took the ones that got past it with short, brutal strokes that ended them before they landed. A wolf got its jaws on his forearm, and he went down under it, and she took its head off over him without a wasted motion, and hauled him back up by the collar in the same movement. It lasted perhaps the length of 10 breaths, and felt like an hour. Then the pack broke and ran, and there was blood on the snow and blood on the floor, and the two of them stood in the ruined doorway shaking, and Jorge started helplessly to laugh, because he was alive, because she had reached down through a wolf to pull him up, because there was simply nothing else to do with it. After a moment she laughed too. She bound his arm that night, clumsy and careful with her huge fingers, in the same spot on the same bed where he had bound her thigh. And neither of them said what had passed between them in the doorway. That instant, where she had put her own body over his without a heartbeat's thought. But it was there in the room with them now, and it did not leave. The wolf had torn his coat sleeve from wrist to elbow. The next evening, without being asked, she took the coat onto her lap by the fire and set about mending it. It was absurd to watch. A warrior who could cleave an oak, threading a bone needle by firelight, her huge fingers pinching the thin cloth, her whole face bent close and frowning in concentration over a task made for smaller hands than hers. Jorge did not offer to help, though he could have done it in half the time. He sat across the fire and watched her hands work his ruined sleeve whole again, stitch by careful stitch, and she felt him watching and did not look up. And neither of them said one word the whole while. There was nothing that needed saying. The fire ticked. The needle went in and out. When she was done, she shook the coat out and laid it over his shoulders herself, and her hand rested there a moment longer than the task required. And that was all. It was the most either of them had ever said to the other. 2 mornings later, walking the ridge to see what the wolves had scattered, Jorge found the scout. He was an orc, or had been. A lean young warrior frozen sitting upright against a pine a half-mile from the cabin, days dead. A spyglass still frozen to his hand, and his eyes fixed downhill in the exact direction of the smoke from Jorge's chimney. He had not died of the wolves. He had died of the cold, watching, and in his quiver were arrows fletched in black. Tucked into his breast, stiff with frost, was a folded order. Jorge could not read the orc script, but Catherine could, and he watched her face empty as she did. It was Mulgrim's hand, she said at last. She would know it anywhere. The man had signed 3 generations of the clan's decrees in that same patient, unhurried script. The order instructed its bearer to confirm the death of the false queen and bring back proof of it. And it closed. She read aloud in a flat voice, with the advisor's blessing on the work, that the bearer should not grieve the doing of it. For a clan is a living body, and a wise healer does not weep to cut away the part that has begun to rot. Jorge said nothing. He understood then that the man hunting her did not hate her, that he had ordered her death the way another man orders a field cleared, and thought himself kind for it, and that this was a far colder thing than hatred. Catherine folded the order back along its creases and did not throw it in the fire. She kept it. Some part of her, he understood, needed to carry the exact shape of what had been done to her, so that she would never again mistake a patient voice for a safe one. Jorge brought one back and laid it on the table beside the snapped shaft he had pulled from the ravine that first hour, and asked Catherine quietly what black arrows meant. The colour went out of her face. She picked up the 2 black shafts and turned them over, and he watched the queen he had not yet met rise up in her, cold and terrible and afraid. She told him only that they belonged to men who were hunting her, and that one of them had sat and watched his home for days before the cold took him, which meant others knew where the first had gone, which meant her time here was already spent. And then Catherine of the Caldmore, who had led warriors at 19 and buried her mother in her mourning paint and never once wept where a living soul could see, put both her hands over her face and broke. It came out of her all at once. 6 years of it. The whole held weight. Brenner in the doorway. The guards dead at their posts. The mother's last command she had been paying and could no longer afford. And under all of it the plain unbearable thing that she was so tired, and that she had let herself be warm in this poor cold room for a handful of days, and now that was going to be taken too. She wept the way people weep who have never once been allowed to. Jorge did not try to fix it. He did not tell her it would be good. He set a stone by the fire to warm the way he had that first night, and when it was ready he wrapped it and set it against her cold feet, and he sat down on the floor beside her within reach and no closer, and stayed. He watched the tears cut clean tracks through the grime on the face of a queen who could split an oak with one blow, and understood, plainly and for the first time, that being terrible and being able to break were not opposite things, that she was, under all the iron, only a person, and had been carrying the weight of pretending otherwise for longer than he had been alive. He stayed until the worst of it had passed through her and out. It was the first time in her life anyone had simply stayed. She would remember it longer than any battle she had ever won. Far to the south, the man who had crossed the river came back to Mulgrim to report that the Watcher had been found frozen at his post, the order still on him, and that below the dead scout's pine, in a clearing at the edge of the human woods. A single chimney-smoked Mulgrim did not smile. He chose 4 of his own Black Arrow guards, the quiet ones, the ones who never asked why, and told them where the chimney was, and that the woman inside had grown careless and warm and easy to reach, and that they were to bring back proof and not to be gentle. Then he put one last question to his informant, and was given the answer he wanted, and for the first time in a fortnight allowed himself to believe the throne was truly his. The 4 rode north through the tail of the storm. They were half a day out from the cabin when the horns of another company, riding hard up from the south, carried thin across the snow behind them, but by then the 4 were already too far ahead to be caught. They had, perhaps, 2 more days of quiet after that. They were the best 2 days either of them had had in years, and they both knew what the Black Arrows meant, and that knowing was in every hour of it like salt. On the first of those nights he fell asleep where he sat, worn through, his head tipping sideways until it came to rest against her arm by the fire. He did not mean to. He woke stiff and cold in the grey before dawn to find that she had not moved at all, that the great warm bulk of her had stayed exactly still through the whole long night, arm gone dead beneath his weight because she had not wanted to wake him. She had done for him without a word the very thing he had once done for her. Neither of them mentioned it. They did not need to. Then the horns came down from the north. 3 notes, a silence. 3 notes again, and Catherine was on her feet before the second call finished. All the ease of the days burned off between one breath and the next. She told him then, fast and flat, because there was no time left to soften any part of it. She was Catherine of the Caldmore. She was their queen. The men Mulgrim had sent had found her at last, and that meant his life was now worth precisely nothing to whichever of them reached the cabin first. Everything in Jorge's memory rearranged itself at once. The green stone ring, The courtly manners, the torn braid he had mended with his own clumsy hands, the way she had held herself, even half dead in the mud, as though the ravine were beneath her. A queen. He had been feeding a queen scorched barley and carving her a horse out of pine. What came after the shock caught him off guard. It was not awe, it hurt. He asked her quietly how many nights she had let him hand her warm stones and pour out the worst hours of his life, and had looked him in the eye through a caving storm and named herself a common soldier, all while knowing she was the kind of person a man like him was not even supposed to raise his eyes to. And he watched, astonished, the queen's iron mask crack straight across, because underneath it she was afraid of him, of this, of a poor man's refusal. She told him the truth and ran the opposite way. She had not told him who she was for exactly the reason he feared the worst of, because for the first time in her life, someone had treated her as nothing more or less than a person, and she had wanted to go on being only a person a little longer. With him, she had been more herself than she had managed to be in 6 years. Then the door blew inward off its top hinge, and the men who came through it carried black arrows, 4 of Mulgrim's warriors, sent to make certain the Caldmore queen never reached a living soul who might still hold to her. What followed was fast and close and ugly. Catherine snatched up the hatchet and moved like weather given a body. Bad leg and all, but there were 4, and she was not yet whole. And one got around her and came at Jorge, where he stood with nothing but the hearth-iron. Jorge did not fight like a warrior. He fought like a man who knew his own single room in the pitch dark. He hooked a boot under the low barley sack and dragged it into the man's shins, so he pitched forward into the stone lip of the hearth, and brought the iron down with both hands, and all the strength 6 years of running traplines and hauling game had put into his thin arms. And when a second warrior slid a blade along Catherine's flank and she dropped to one knee, it was Jorge who threw his whole light body across the reaching sword arm and hung off it, just long enough for her to turn inside the man's guard and end it. Then the room was quiet and full of smoke, and it was over, and they were both alive and both bleeding. She looked at him across it. He had a cut over his eyebrow leaking into his eye, and his hands would not stop shaking, and he had just killed a man to keep alive a queen from a world that would never let him near her. And she told him the truth she had been holding since the morning the jay stole the apple, that she had commanded thousands and been alone in all of it, and that in his cold, poor cabin she had been seen at last as only herself. And she did not want to hand that back now that she finally had the name of the thing she had been starving for. And Jorge, dragging his sleeve across the blood in his eye, told her that he did not care that she was a queen, that he had fallen for the woman who laughed at a thieving bird and burned his soup and let him mend her braid, and that woman he meant to keep even if the crown came fastened to her. They had both fallen entirely in love, and neither had meant to say so. And there, in the smoke and the wreckage, they each at last said it anyway, before the Queen makes the offer that gives this story its name. Take 1 second for us. If Catherine and Jorge have pulled you in this far, subscribe to Orkbon Saga and tell us in the comments, if you were Jorge, would you have said yes? Your likes and your comments are what carry these tales to more people who need them. And the best part of their story is only the beginning. Her true guard reached the cabin at dawn. They came up out of the south at a hard gallop. 30 riders, under a scarred captain named Roland, who had hacked his own way clear of the coup, and then spent 11 days hunting the north for his queen. When Catherine stepped through the broken doorway into the thin grey light, upright and alive, the whole company went down onto one knee in the frost, as a single body. Roland was the first to rise, and the first to notice the human standing in the ruined doorway, and the first to notice the 4 dead men inside with black arrows in their quivers and a trapper's hearth-iron through one of their skulls. He looked at the small human, and at the dead warriors, and at the hatchet, and back at the human, and a slow and deeply unmilitary grin spread across his scarred face. He remarked to no one in particular that in 11 days of hard riding he had not expected to find that his queen's rescuer had already killed better men than most of the riders behind him, and that he, for one, would be keeping his opinions about humans to himself from this morning forward. It was the closest thing to a blessing anyone in that clearing was going to get. And Catherine shot her captain a look that would have felled a lesser orc, and Roland, entirely unbothered, went to see about the horses. He came back a moment later, crouched in the wreck of the doorway to study the boot under the barley sack trick Jorge had used on the man by the hearth, worked out exactly how it had been done, and told the human, with the grave respect of one professional to another, that it was a filthy piece of work and that he would be stealing it. From that morning Roland called Jorge by his name and no one else's title, walked half a step behind him in strange halls without being asked, and let it be known, in the flat way of a man who has decided a thing and will not be discussing it, that any orc with a grievance about the Queen's choice was welcome to bring it to her captain first. Not many did. Later, quieter, he told Catherine the truth of his timing. His outriders had cut the human's trail a full night before Mulgrim's killers ever reached the valley, and he had held his whole company back at the mouth of it in the dark, watching the cabin through a glass, because he could not tell from a distance whether the small human was his queen's jailer or her keeper. It was only when he had seen, through that glass, the man fall asleep sitting up against her by the window, and had seen her stay unmoving through the cold so as not to wake him, that he had known and had let his warriors stand down, and had turned his face away from them once so none would see what it did to him. It was the only time any of them ever knew the captain to weep. Catherine's leg was mending. Her people had come. She was, by every measure the world troubled to keep, lifted clean back out of a trapper's reach. And she crossed the frost to him, in front of every one of them, and reminded him of a thing he had said by his own fire. He had named her his wife, she said. In jest, he had told her. But he had said it aloud, with the fire for a witness. And among her people a thing said aloud is a thing meant. And she had frozen that night, not because she was angry, but because no one had ever, in all her life, named her as a thing to be kept warm, rather than a thing to be wielded. She asked him plainly whether he had meant it. He said it had been a joke. She asked whether it was still a joke. He opened his mouth to say yes and found he could not. Maybe not, he said. Maybe not. She nodded slowly, as though he had finally answered a question she had carried out of a burning cabin and all the long road home. Among orcs, she reminded him, there was no space between a thing said and a thing meant. That was the whole of what he called their bluntness and what she called their honesty. He had named her his by his own fire. She had waited, through wolves and black arrows and the worst hours of her life, to learn whether a human meant his words the way an orc meant them. She had her answer now. Then she did it the orc way, because she did not know how to do it any other, and would not have if she could. She told him she loved him, as a fact laid on the table and not a question. She offered him marriage true and full, to stand and rule beside her as her equal, and warned him in the same breath, because she would not buy his answer with a lie, that her clan would hate it, that half of them would never bend to a human at their queen's side, that the road she was asking him onto would be the hardest thing either of them ever set a foot to. And then, quietly, because she had learned one thing from him across a fortnight of warm stones, that she would not command him to it. The whole of the choice was his. She was terrified. She had gathered every scrap of power she held and laid it into his split and shaking hands, and stood in front of her own army with nothing left to shield herself. He did not answer at once, and she did not look to be answered. She gave him the day. He walked out alone into the hollow pine and stood a long time among the frozen snares and game trails he had worked for 6 years, and thought about the small grave and about the warm stones she had never known. He watched her tuck against her cold feet, and about the horse he had carved her out of pine. And somewhere in the grey afternoon he understood that the fear of not being enough was the very same fear that had walled him up alone at the end of the world all these years, and that he had already let it take one whole life out of his hands, and was under no law that said he had to stand still and let it take a second. He came back before the light failed. He told her he was terrified and did not dress it up. He wanted none of her kingdom, he said, not half a hold or a title or a seat above a hall. He wanted only her, the woman and not the crown, and if being with her meant learning to survive her whole impossible world, he would set himself to learning it, badly at first, and better in time, for as long as she would keep him. Catherine closed the last of the frost between them, and took his rough-cut face between her two enormous hands, gentle as he had once been over a splinter in her palm, and set her brow against his in the way of a Caldmore oath, which binds harder and longer than any soft human vow. And then, so low that only he heard it, she gave him at last the two words she had frozen over by the fire, the two words a queen had never once said to any living soul, and meant with the whole of herself. She accepted. For a long moment, Jorge said nothing at all. He could not. The whole clearing seemed to go still with him. 30 warriors not daring to breathe, the wind dropping, only the small tick of melting frost off the eaves and the far-off stamp of a horse. He stood there with the queen's forehead against his, and the entire weight of two worlds waiting on him, and he let the silence hold, because there were no words in either of their languages large enough to put into it. Only then did he lift his own scarred hands and hold her face the way she was holding his. Two whole worlds stood in a dead man's clearing and watched a queen bind herself to nobody, and the nobody held on to her as though she were the one warm thing left in a frozen country, which, to him by then, she plainly was. And still, even then, even with his brow against hers and her whole army kneeling in the frost, one cold thread would not leave her. Someone had sold Mulgrim the road she rode. Someone who had known the Eastern Gate by heart had loosed those arrows onto the one path out of 10 she took, and that someone had not died in the coup, and was not among the dead in the cabin, and was therefore, by the plainest arithmetic, still breathing, still free, and in all likelihood kneeling somewhere in the loyal ranks around her at that very moment. Head bowed, grieving beautifully. She said nothing of it to anyone, but she looked once slowly across the bent backs of her own warriors in the snow. And she did not forget. They rode north for 9 days, up out of the human woods and into her country, and Jorge saw for the first time the world she had come from. The Caldmore hold was not a castle in any sense he had a word for. It was a mountain that had been made into a fortress, a whole grey peak, hollowed and cut and built upon, across 3 centuries. Ringed walls climbing the living rock, black iron gates set into the stone throat of a pass, watchfires burning on ledges 1,000 feet up where the air ran thin, and over all of it the aurora moving across the winter sky like a slow green sea. 10,000 orcs lived under that mountain. Jorge sat his borrowed horse at the mouth of the pass and looked up at it and understood, in a way no ring or braid ever had made him understand, exactly how small a thing he was to be carrying into her world. Then the gates opened, because Mulgrim's grip had never been more than fear, and fear breaks the instant a true queen is seen alive at the head of an army. Taking back the Caldmore hold cost blood. Because Mulgrim did not run, they found him in the great hall on his own borrowed throne, unhurried, grey and patient to the last, so certain of his own reasoning that he did not reach for a weapon even when the doors came down. He told Catherine, in the flat, reasonable voice of a man explaining weather to a child, that he had done nothing her mother would not have done, that a clan is not a family and cannot afford to be governed by one, that she had always been too much her mother's daughter and not enough her clan's queen. He looked at the human standing at her shoulder and said that this small, soft thing she had dragged out of the woods, was the whole of his argument. A queen who chose weakness would breed weakness into the blood. He said he was, even now, only trying to save the Caldmore from her. Catherine did not kill him where he sat, though every warrior in the hall waited for it. She had him bound and brought before the assembly and judged by the clan's own law, in the open, for the murder of her guards and of Brenna, so that no orc could ever say she had spilled a rival's blood in the dark the way he had spilled hers. He went to the block still certain he had been right, and he was smiling when he knelt. He told Catherine almost kindly, almost as a gift, that she would learn soon enough what he had learned in 50 years at the foot of that throne, that winning a crown was the easy part, and that she would spend the rest of her short reign discovering how much harder it was to keep one. Then he bent his neck without being told, and did not flinch, and the smile was the last thing to leave his face. It was, Roland said afterward, the most dangerous thing his queen had ever done, and the wisest, because a clan will forgive strength almost anything. But it remembers for generations the ruler who chose the law over the easy knife. Catherine never forgot the smile. On the worst nights of the years that followed, when the man's cold promise seemed to be coming true, it was Jorge's plain company. By the fire that reminded her Mulgrim had been wrong about. The one thing that mattered, that a throne is not kept by iron alone. There was one thing Mulgrim carried to the block that gnawed at Catherine long after the smile had left his face. The eastern stable gate, the night she fled, had been unlocked from the inside, and Mulgrim had been in the assembly hall before 100 witnesses when it was opened. He had not turned that key himself. Someone else had. Someone who had known her flight by heart and had set the black arrows on the one road she rode, and that someone had not died in the coup and had not stood among Mulgrim's guard, and was therefore still alive, still free, and by every cold calculation still close. She had the whole hold searched for the stone. She found nothing. The traitor had been careful and patient and was plainly content to wait. She told no one but Jorge, and on the nights the old dread came for her after that. It was no longer Mulgrim's grey face she saw, but a faceless one she could not name, somewhere under her own roof, smiling the way he had smiled. That did not end the objection. It only changed the men who made it. The elders met Catherine in the great stone hall and did not trouble to disguise their disgust at the human she meant to raise beside her. And an orc of high blood, a champion named Jorven, who had wanted her hand and her passes, invoked an ancient right to contest the match, expecting a trial of arms, expecting the human to last 3 heartbeats. But the old right, when Jorge made the elders read it out in full and slow, named only a trial of the queen's choosing, and Catherine chose a trial of provision, the oldest test of a mate's fitness there was, older than the sword, each man given a hard portion of winter and set over the most vulnerable in the hold, the sick and the old and the parentless young, and judged at the thaw on how many he had kept breathing. Jorven was a warrior, and knew nothing of keeping the frail alive. Jorge knew almost nothing else. There was one old warrior in his charge, a one-eyed veteran named Gruk, who had lost 3 fingers in a border fight before Jorge was born, and who made it plain on the first day that he would take nothing from a soft-handed human, and would as soon die under an honest sky. He came down with lung fever in the hard middle of the winter. Jorge did not argue and did not force him. He simply came each night and sat on the cold floor by the old orc's pallet, out of reach, keeping the fire fed and a pot of thin broth warm, and talked low into the dark about ordinary things, the weather, the wood, the small fox he was whittling to pass the hours. On the worst night, Gruk's own hand reached out for the broth. By the thaw, the old warrior was on his feet and swearing, had appointed himself the human's shadow, and carried that carved fox in his belt pouch to the end of his days, and would show it unasked. To anyone fool enough to say a word against Jorge in his hearing, not everyone lived. There was a child among the frailest in his charge, a small orc girl of 5, with a cough that had gone down into her chest before the winter even began, and Jorge sat up with her 9 nights running, doing everything 6 years of hard-won knowledge had taught him. The steam, the herbs, the cold cloths, the warm stone at her feet. On the 10th night she died anyway, quietly, near dawn, the way his own daughter had, and the old wound tore open in him as though it had never once closed. He carried her out himself and would let no one else do it. Then something in him that had held for 6 years simply gave, and the man who had pulled a queen from the mud and killed for her and stood alone against a hall of orcs sat down on the cold stone floor and could not get up, certain past all argument that he was a man who failed the ones who needed him most, that he always had, that kindness in his hands was a lie because it never once arrived in time. Catherine found him there. And she did for him, without a word of instruction from anyone, the exact thing he had done for her in the cabin on the worst night of her life. She did not tell him it was not his fault, because he would not have heard it. She warmed a stone at the fire and wrapped it, and set it in his cold hands, and she sat down on the floor beside him within reach, and no closer, and stayed. And after a long while, when the worst of it had passed through him, She gave him back his own medicine, in her own blunt words, the very thing she had told him that first fireside night about Elizabeth. Returned to him now when he needed it, that some fights are lost the moment they begin, before any choice is offered, and there is no shame owed for losing them. She said he had not failed the child. She said the child had died warm and held, and not alone, in a winter that would have taken her in a ditch, and that this was not nothing, that it was, in fact, very nearly everything, and the only kind of everything the world ever actually let a person give. It was the first time he had ever let her carry him. It was the moment, more than the wolves or the offer or the oath, that they each stopped being a person the other was falling for and became, simply, home. He kept every other soul in his charge alive to the thaw. Joven withdrew his claim. It won Jorge no love from the elders, but it won him the one thing that carried weight in a hall of orcs, which was grudging respect. The doubt that came nearest to beating them did not come from the clan. It came from inside him. Day after day, he watched Catherine in the great hall, feared and adored, and felt to the marrow how far above him she stood, and began, without meaning to make himself smaller. And then Mulgrim's surviving faction moved, not by law now, but by knife, reasoning that a dead human consort would shame the queen into abandoning the match. They came for Jorge in a corridor at night. He would have died there if Grook, who slept across his threshold now like a bad-tempered hound, had not heard the wrong footstep and roared the hall awake. Roland reached him first, before even Catherine, and knelt in the dark over the bleeding human he had once found standing in a ruined doorway. And when he had seen that the wound was not mortal, he did not make a joke, which for Roland was itself a kind of alarm. He only said, quiet and flat, loud enough for the corridor and every shadow in it to hear, that the human was under the captain's own shield from this night forward, and that any orc who still wished him harm had until sunrise to make peace with their ancestors, because they would be meeting them before the light came. No one tested it. From then on, the warriors who had merely tolerated Jorge for their queen's sake began, quietly, to guard him for the captains. And a thing that had been the queen's private scandal started to become the warband's shared point of honor. That was the night that broke it open. In the great hall, before the whole assembly, an elder rose and said aloud what all of them had been muttering, that the human was a wound in the side of the clan, that every drop of blood spilled over him was blood spilled for weakness, that a true queen would set the soft creature aside and take a proper mate before he cost them anything more. And the hall did not disagree. The hall was silent in the way that means agreement. Catherine's warriors looked at their boots. Even Roland held his tongue, because there are fights a captain cannot win for the ones he loves. And into that silence, the small human stood up. He did not raise his voice. He said that he had buried a wife and a child with these two soft hands. In the ground the frost would not give up easily, and that he knew the exact weight of a thing you fail to save. He said that people survive because someone sharpens the swords, but they endure because someone stays awake beside the dying. And he said that every orc in that hall who had lived through the last hard winter had lived through it because those same soft hands had sat up through the nights they were dying. And if that was weakness, then he would ask the elder to point out one warrior in the room strong enough to have done it in his place. The hall stayed silent, but it was a different silence now. Then old Grook got to his feet at the back and drew the small carved fox out of his belt pouch and set it on the stone floor with a click that carried the length of the hall, and said only that the human had kept him alive when he had begged to be let die, and that any orc who wanted the human set aside could come through the fox first. One by one, down the long benches, the ones Jorge had carried through the winter stood up beside him, an old woman, a boy with a wooden hair in his fist, a scarred warrior, then another, until it was no longer the human standing alone against the hall, but the hall standing divided. And the elder who had spoken sat slowly back down. They did not win everyone that night. Some of the outer holds broke away rather than bend to a human at the queen's side, and the clan Catherine kept was smaller and poorer than the one her mother had left her. She let them go without a backward look. What remained answered her horn freely and was, for the first time, entirely and only her own. They won the right to belong to one another, and it cost them dearly, and neither ever pretended otherwise. He never became a warrior, and she never asked for it. He became instead a thing the Caldmore had never had, a consort who sat in the war council and offered the single view no orc in the room could give it. The reckoning of the frail and the poor and the small, daily mercies that hold a people together as surely as any wall of stone. He carved through the long evenings, foxes and hares and folded wrens, and they became the most fought-over toys in the whole of the north. There was not a child in the hold who did not sleep with one of the humans' animals in their fist. He learned her tongue badly and then well, and he never did teach her to make the soup. She ruined it faithfully, gloriously for the rest of their days, and he made it instead every hard evening, the way he had that first week, and it stayed their private measure of the years, the way it had been from the start. Once, years in, on an evening when the council had gone badly and he had come home grey and quiet, she took the pot from him and made the soup herself and burned it black on purpose, and set the bowl in front of him and told him gravely, with the whole weight of a queen behind it, that it had character. It was the first joke she had ever made at her own expense, throwing his old kindness back at him across all those years. And he laughed until he had to sit down and put his head on the table, and she watched him do it and looked quietly, more pleased with herself than she had the day she took back her throne. She grew softer with him behind their own door than she had let herself be with any living soul, and harder and surer out in the world for having the one place she did not have to be either. For the first time in her life, she held the love and the duty both at once, and was not made to bleed the one to feed the other. She wore her braid again, the great complex rope of it worked tight and deliberate as any queen's, but into the plaiting now, where any orc could read it and none could mistake it. She had woven a single lock she made him give her, a human strand run through the whole length of a Caldmore braid, 2 worlds bound in a thing that could not be undone without unmaking the rest. The elders hated it. She wore it to every council. There was a day, that first spring after the trials, that the hold would talk of for a generation. It had come late snow, fat and slow and silent, and the whole clan had gathered in the great open yard for the naming of the season, hundreds of them, warriors and elders and children ranked in the falling white. And the Queen of the Caldmore came out before all of them, and did a thing no queen had ever done in the open. She sat on a low stone in the centre of the yard, and bared the back of her head, and let the human kneel behind her, and unbind and replet her royal braid, where every eye in the clan could watch him do it. It was the most private thing an orc owned, that braid, rank and name and blood, and she gave it into a human's hands, in front of the entire people, in the snow, in silence, and let them make of it what they would. Some of the elders turned away, but the children pushed to the front to see, and the old warriors Jorge had carried through the winter stood with their carved animals in their fists, and the snow came down and whitened his dark hair and her darker braid alike until, from across the yard, you could no longer easily tell where the human ended and the queen began. It was the picture the clan kept of them after, the 2 of them in the falling snow, his rough hands working her hair whole, and neither of them saying anything at all. Years turned, and a small custom grew up in the Caldmore hold that no elder had decreed, and no one could quite say who had started, though everyone knew. On the hard nights, warriors began setting warm stones at the feet of the old and the sick and the newly grieving, wrapped in cloth against the cold, expecting nothing back for it. They did not call it a human thing. They would have been insulted to hear it named so, but it had come from a human all the same, and it had made them, in some small stubborn way, into a warmer people than 3 centuries of iron had managed. On a grey evening near the turn of a later year, an orphan of the clan, a small orc girl whose parents the last border fight had taken, was found asleep in the corner of the great hall where she was not supposed to be, curled up against the cold stone with something clutched tight in both fists. When Catherine bent to lift her gently, she saw what it was, one of Jorge's carved wrens, worn smooth from handling, and beside the child's small bare feet, Set there by some hand that had gone quietly away again, a warm stone wrapped in cloth. The queen stood a long moment over the sleeping child, and could not speak. She carried the girl to the fire herself, and the child, half waking, held up the little wooden wren for the terrifying queen of the Caldmore to admire, and Catherine admired it gravely as though it were the finest thing in all her holds. In a way she could not have explained to a single one of her elders it was. That night she leaned into him the way she had that first evening, by the dying fire, the great warm weight of her settling against his side, and he rested his head on her shoulder, the way she had once rested hers against his. She reminded him of the ravine, the dead horse, the frozen mud, the fool in a coat too thin for the wind who came sliding down the ice to save a creature he had every reason to fear. They marveled at the sheer flat unlikeliness of it, that a stolen strip of apple and a burned pot of soup and a careless joke about a sweet wife had reached all the way from that one cold room to this one, and out of such small and foolish things had built an entire world. She had been a queen who held everything and had never once been seen. He had been a nobody who had lost the whole of what he loved and believed he had nothing left worth giving. In a world that swore to both of them plainly and often that it could not be done, they chose each other anyway. The first words she'd ever spoken to him, half dead in the frozen mud with a stranger's hands on her wound, had been an order to leave her. He remembered it. So did she. And now, on this quiet grey evening years down the long road from that ravine, with a sleeping orphan by the fire, and a warm stone at the child's feet, and a human strand woven through her braid, she turned her great head and set her brow against his and told him, softly, the opposite of the thing she had said at the start. She told him to stay. 3 centuries of iron had taught the Caldmore how to survive. It took one starving human, a warm stone, a burned pot of soup, a mended braid, to teach them why survival had never, on its own, been enough. Far to the north, past the last of the Caldmore watchfires, where the aurora burned coldest over a country no map troubled to name, a lone rider reined in on a ridge and looked back the long way toward the mountain where a human now slept beside a queen. The rider carried no banner anyone would know, but in the frozen quiver at their back, wrapped against the wet, were arrows, and the fletching on them, when the green light caught it, was dyed a familiar black. Someone had opened a gate once and never been found. Someone had watched a queen ride out to die and been disappointed. And someone, on a cold ridge under a burning sky, had just learned that she had not merely lived, but had gone and made herself into something far more dangerous than a queen alone. She had made herself happy. That is where this tale ends. The next one had already begun. Thank you for staying with Catherine and Jorge to the very end. That last rider on the ridge, those black arrows, the traitor who was never found. Part 2 of the Orkbond saga is coming, and you will not want to miss where this goes next. If this story moved you, subscribe and turn on the bell so it reaches you the moment it drops. Leave a like to help it find more hearts like yours. And tell us in the comments, who do you think opened that gate? We read everyone. Until the next tale of 2 worlds, take care of each other, and we will see you in the north.